There never did, there never will, and there never can exist a parliament or any description of men or any generation of men in any country possessed of the right or the power of binding and controlling posterity to the end of time, or of commanding forever how the world shall be governed, or who shall govern it. And therefore, all such clauses, acts, or declarations by which the makers of them attempt to do what they have neither the right nor the power to do, nor the power to execute, are in and of themselves null and void. Every age and every generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the ages and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. It is the living and not the dead that are to be accommodated. When man ceases to be, his power and his wants cease with him. Having no longer any participation in the concerns of the world, he has no longer any authority in directing who shall be its governors, or how its government shall be organized, or how administered. So, who wrote that? That was T-Paine, Thomas Paine, but he did sign documents T-Paine, and so I think that's how we should refer to him. I'm reading that just from the Broadview Anthology of British Literature. This just happens to be a text or a book that I have that had that text in it. But that document is called The Rights of Man, which, if you remember anything from history class, you have probably read parts of that document even in elementary school. But it was written by T-Paine in 1791 and 1792, and it's considered one of the foundational documents in the United States. Thomas Paine is one of America's founding fathers. There's not historical proof that he was involved in the writing of the Declaration of Independence, but it's largely believed that he was. There's some evidence that he might be referenced on the back of a couple of the original copies. Either way, he was extremely influential in the founding of the country. And that piece from Rights of Man that I just read to you, I guess let's start with what is it really saying. You shouldn't have to be governed by people who are dead. So like he says, once somebody dies, their will dies with them. And the government should exist for the people who are alive now. That is who the government is for. It's not a vanity project in which we just keep following all these rules because they were passed down to us by people who are dead now. Why am I talking about it? Well, a couple reasons. One, I've believed for quite some time that it's crazy that we have such reverence for a 250-year-old Constitution. And I mean reverence in the sense that we follow it so religiously. I think there's tons of reasons to be reverent of it for its place in history and for what it meant at the time, right? And there's a lot of it's a groundbreaking document, right? I don't want to just shit on that document, but that we adhere to it so strongly 250 years later is, to me, insane. The United States Constitution is the longest surviving written charter of government. And just to cite my source, that's from the United States Senate, Senate.gov. But it's a somewhat well-known piece of trivia that you can look into. But the United States government, which is essentially organized and empowered by the Constitution, is thus one of the oldest extant governments in the world, again, based on that Constitution. And based on a written constitution. That is often used as kind of like a bit of bragging rights, right? But it feels more and more, right, these days, like that's quite the hindrance. It kind of feels like we have a 250-year-old government. Not least of all because some of our senators seem like they have been in the government for that long. The reason why I wanted to talk about it is because Donald Trump is blowing through the Constitution and blowing through all these kind of norms and traditions and laws, very important laws, that are kind of foundational to how we govern things in the United States. And the Democrats' response to that has been to essentially kick and scream that that's not the way it's supposed to be done. That's illegal. That's, unconstitutional. I think that's really ineffective. I think the proof is in the pudding, right? We can all see how effective that's been. But the main reason why I really think it's ineffective is because we lose the opportunity to discuss why we should be doing things the way that we do them. And I mean that to say that a lot of the ways that we do things, maybe we shouldn't be doing it that way. I know that we shouldn't be doing them that way. I guarantee you that if we were to be writing a governing document for now, we wouldn't be writing it this way. This Constitution we have, we would not be creating that document again. There's some really great stuff in there, don't get me wrong. But it is outdated, and most countries, especially in the West, have rewritten their constitutions, if they have a written constitution, many times since the United States first drafted its constitution. We luckily have a process for amendments to the Constitution, but that seems like that's increasingly like a not going to happen kind of attitude for most Americans. Most Americans don't even remember the last time we amended the Constitution, even though it was in the 90s. We did it in the early 90s. It was the last time that we amended the Constitution. I think we should just do a whole new Constitution. But at the very least, we need to make a lot of changes to that document. And we need to get people comfortable with that idea and get people to realize that that's something we need to do as a society, because the social contract has been broken. Americans increasingly feel, rightly so, like the government doesn't represent them, doesn't have their interests at heart, is constantly working against their interests, and that the government feels broken. People have a very negative view of government, and it doesn't need to be that way. The government can do a lot of really great things. It's just that a lot of people don't feel like it's something that they are protected by or that they have a stake in, right? And so, with Democrats kicking and screaming that Donald Trump's breaking the Constitution and breaking the law and not following the rules, I think it's far more effective for us on the left to stop letting ourselves be bound by whether or not the Constitution allows it. I'm not sure that I fully believe the next thing that I'm about ready to say, but there could be a argument for what Donald Trump is doing right now, having at least the benefit of tearing down a lot of these walls and barriers between us and a governing document and a governing structure that is new and that reflects what we actually want. Now, what Donald Trump's going to do in place of what we have currently is not broadly supported. I mean, everyone should keep in mind Donald Trump may have won the popular vote and he may have won the election, and I don't want to take any of that away from him. But he didn't even win a majority of voters, right? Like he won a plurality. He won 49% of the votes. And then we have a very anti-democratic legislature in the Senate. I mean, the Senate should not be structured the way that it is. The Senate, I personally believe, shouldn't even exist. We should just have a very large House of Representatives. We have so many things that function in American society that are outside of what was in the Constitution. And this is actually what really got me thinking about it. But, for instance, the Supreme Court, right? A lot of us, our understanding of the Supreme Court is that, it's the highest court in the land, and when cases are appealed or something is, viewed as constitutional or unconstitutional, it makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides, and it strikes down laws that are unconstitutional and upholds ones that are constitutional. That process, which is called judicial review, that's not in the Constitution. That's not in the Constitution. That was decided in a case, Marbury v. Madison. That was essentially when the Supreme Court decided that it had the right and that it was the highest arbiter of what is and is not constitutional. The Constitution can definitely be interpreted to give equal right for determining what is and is not constitutional to all three branches of government. The way we've operated has been that the Supreme Court gets to decide those kinds of things, but it's certainly not the way the Constitution is written. The Constitution doesn't say, hey, the Supreme Court gets cases and it strikes things down that are unconstitutional. That's not in there. Very surprising to a lot of people, I think, but it's not in there. And the reason why I started thinking about that is because, we're coming up on what a lot of people are going to describe as a constitutional crisis. And I understand where they're coming from. But J.D. Vance, other Republicans have been kind of starting this conversation on social media that about whether or not the judiciary, being the courts, have the right to strike down things that Donald Trump does. And, are they right to ask that question? I think they are. Now, do I want there to be no check on Donald Trump? No. No, I do not want that. But we're going to, I think, fail to meet the moment of Donald Trump if our sole response to that is going to be, no, that's the way we've been doing it for 250 years. He's going against the traditions and the institutions. He's breaking the law. He's breaking the Constitution. Americans don't care about the institutions anymore. They are not serving us. And we need to get out ahead of this idea and start talking about what is the country that we want? What is the government that we actually want? Stop shackling ourselves to a document that was written by a bunch of dead guys, especially when many of those dead guys would not want us to do that either. They put the Constitution together the way they did with the amendment process so that we wouldn't be shackled to them. It's not a revolutionary idea, or it's an American revolutionary idea, but it's not. This is the way it was meant to work. We're supposed to kind of tear these things down and build a government that is reflective of what we want. And so I would encourage you, as these kind of conversations come up, to resist that urge to kind of like point to the Constitution and say, but this is how we've always done it. Start talking about the way that you want things to be done, and stop doing the democratic thing where it's like, sticking to the rules and sticking to traditions and sticking to institutions for the sake of those institutions. If those things aren't serving us anymore, start talking about the way that things should operate. And when the question comes up like, well, you can't do that because of this rule or this law or this part of the Constitution, just remember that all that can change. We can get rid of any of it like that. These are all human structures. We are not shackled to any of it. We can do whatever we want. We can really do whatever we want. It's all made up. We can set whole new rules tomorrow. And the Republicans got that memo, and they are setting whole new rules. And if we keep kicking and screaming about the old rule book, we're going to get left in the dust. So that's my thoughts here on this Tuesday. I hope everyone's doing well.